What happens when one sentence quietly erases an entire lifetime? Not shouted, not argued, just dropped at a dinner table and left to rot in the air like something everyone pretends not to smell. Because that's how it began for me. Not with screaming or violence or slammed doors, but with a casual cruelty delivered as if it were a fact. The kind people say when they've already decided your value for you. When she leaned back in her chair and said, almost bored, that I eat but don't help, that I take up space and give nothing back, that I sit there like a responsibility no one asked for. And the words didn't come wrapped in anger, which somehow made them sharper, more final, as if she'd rehearsed them privately and was simply checking them off a list. And what stunned me most wasn't her voice, but the silence that followed, because my son didn't look up, didn't pause, didn't even slow the rhythm of his chewing, as if nothing of importance had been said, as if decades of my life had just been summarized and dismissed between bites of meatloaf. And I remember holding my fork halfway to my mouth, frozen not because I didn't know what to say, but because I suddenly understood that anything I said would make me smaller, not larger, would turn me into a defense instead of a person. And in that moment, something colder than anger settled inside me, something heavier than hurt, a realization that the room had already moved on without me, that my presence had become optional, even inconvenient. And I wondered then, not for the first time, how long this had been true before they finally said it out loud. Because cruelty rarely appears fully formed. It grows quietly, fed by silence, by convenience, by people choosing peace over truth until truth becomes uncomfortable. And as I chewed and swallowed and set my fork down, I felt my body remind me of its limits, the ache in my fingers, the stiffness in my back, the pain that made certain movements slow and careful, pain I never spoke about because pain has a way of making people impatient. And I didn't explain that scrubbing floors hurt now, that lifting laundry made my wrists burn, that I contributed in the ways my body still allowed, not because I owed them proof, but because I loved them once. And love has a habit of outliving appreciation. And I noticed my grandson across the table, his eyes darting between faces, sensing the shift without understanding it, the way children always do when something breaks that no one admits has broken. And I thought then about all the meals I had cooked, all the nights I had stayed awake worrying, all the years I had given freely because giving felt like breathing back then, automatic and necessary. And how strange it was that now, in the place I thought was safe, I felt like an intruder waiting to be acknowledged. And I gathered the plates not because I was told to, but because movement felt safer than words, because dignity sometimes looks like doing the next quiet thing without asking permission. And later, alone in the small room they called mine, with a ceiling fan that clicked with every turn and a window too high to see anything meaningful, I lay awake listening to the house live without me. Laughter drifting down the hallway, glasses clinking, a television murmuring like background noise to a life I no longer belonged to. And I didn't cry, because tears require the belief that someone will notice them. And instead I felt that slow, unsettling awareness that this moment hadn't come out of nowhere, that it was the final shape of years of being useful but unacknowledged, present but unseen, valued only for what I provided and quietly resented when I needed rest. And as the night stretched on, my thoughts returned to earlier versions of myself, to the woman who once held this family together with nothing but determination and frayed patience, to the years when my husband was sick and dignity had to be protected daily, to the nights I worked extra shifts so my son wouldn't feel the weight of what we didn't have, to the times I chose silence so others could feel comfortable. And I wondered when silence had stopped being kindness and started becoming permission. Permission for people to forget who I was. Permission for them to decide I was finished contributing simply because my body had slowed. And the question that wouldn't leave me was not whether the words were cruel, but whether they were believed, because cruelty hurts, but belief reshapes reality. And if they truly believed I was just someone who ate and took and offered nothing in return, then this house was no longer a home. It was a waiting room, and I was only tolerated until inconvenience outweighed obligation. And lying there in the dark, listening to the sound of a family I had built continuing without me, I understood something that would change everything that followed, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, which was that staying silent forever would not preserve peace. It would only erase me more thoroughly. And yet I also knew I would not fight, would not plead, would not argue my worth into existence. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to people who underestimate you is let them keep believing it a little longer. And as sleep finally crept in, thin and restless, one thought settled in my mind, quiet but unshakable, that if this was how they saw me now, then they had no idea who they were sitting across from, and what I held, and what I was still capable of remembering. And that realization, more than any insult, was what made me stay calm. Because I wasn't planning an exit yet, I was observing, and what I would learn next would decide everything. Because the next morning, instead of leaving, I did something far more unsettling. I stayed. And the reason I stayed would later make their shock unavoidable. Have you ever realized you became invisible without anyone asking you to leave? That you were still physically present but no longer counted? Because that was the shape of the quiet that settled over me after that dinner. A silence heavier than the words themselves. A silence that followed me into the narrow room they had given me, if you could call it that, a room carved out of what once stored boxes and forgotten things, which felt fitting somehow, because I too had been quietly reclassified as something to tuck away. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling fan clicking in uneven rhythm, each turn sounding like a second ticking away a version of myself I used to recognize, I listened to the house continue without me. The low murmur of voices from the living room, laughter slipping through the walls like it belonged somewhere else, glass tapping glass, the faint hum of a television show I wasn't invited to watch, and I wondered when exactly I had stopped being included by default and started being considered an option. Because exclusion doesn't arrive with ceremony. It arrives in small omissions that add up, and I felt it in the way no one checked on me. In the way my grandson had been sent to bed without a good night from me. In the way the evening closed itself around a version of family that no longer required my presence. And the strange thing was, I wasn't shocked, just hollowed, as if part of me had already rehearsed this outcome long before it happened. Because women like me learn early how to make themselves smaller to keep rooms comfortable. How to turn pain into patience, how to swallow disappointment and call it maturity. And lying there in the dark, I thought about how often I had done exactly that. About the years when my husband was sick and dignity had to be protected with quiet consistency. About the way I learned to function on exhaustion without complaint, because complaining felt indulgent. And how those habits don't disappear when the circumstances change. They become your posture, your instinct, and suddenly you realize that what once made you strong has made you easy to overlook. And I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because crying felt like admitting that I still expected something different. And that expectation had already been worn thin, replaced by a kind of resignation that wasn't despair, but clarity. A clear understanding that this wasn't a bad night, or a misunderstanding, or a mood that would pass. This was a conclusion they had reached long ago and simply hadn't shared with me yet. And the realization didn't come with drama. It came with stillness, with the steady awareness that I had been fading for years without noticing. Fading behind routines and politeness and gratitude that was never returned. And I asked myself then, in the privacy of that room, a question I had avoided for a long time, which was whether love given without acknowledgement eventually turns into permission to be erased. Because I had loved freely, without keeping score, without demanding recognition, believing that decency would remember me even if people didn't. And yet here I was, reduced to a sentence that summarized my entire existence as consumption without contribution. And the more I replayed it, the more I realized what hurt wasn't just the insult, it was the certainty behind it, the confidence with which it was delivered, as if it had been discussed, agreed upon, normalized, And my son's silence echoed louder with every passing minute. Because silence isn't neutral. It takes sides. And his refusal to look at me, to interrupt, to even acknowledge the moment told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. And that knowledge settled into my bones in a way that felt permanent, not painful like a wound, but heavy like truth. And as the night stretched on, my thoughts drifted backward, not because I wanted to live in the past, but because the past was the only place where I still existed fully, where I was seen, where my efforts mattered. And I remembered standing at kitchen counters long past midnight sewing buttons back onto uniforms, counting coins before grocery trips, clipping coupons with hands that didn't ache yet, remembering faces lighting up at meals I cooked without being asked, remembering a version of myself that was needed without having to justify it. And the contrast between then and now felt almost surreal, like two separate lives sharing one body. And I wondered when exactly usefulness had replaced worth in the minds of the people I raised, when contribution became the only currency that counted. And what frightened me most was not that they believed it, but that I had started to question myself, had started to wonder if maybe I really was less now, if slowing down meant losing legitimacy, if needing rest meant forfeiting belonging. And that was the most dangerous part of all, because once you accept someone else's definition of your value, you begin to disappear on your own. And I knew, lying there in the dark, listening to the ceiling fan click like a reminder that time does not pause for anyone, that something had shifted irreversibly, not outwardly, but inwardly. Because while they laughed and relaxed and moved on from the evening as if nothing significant had occurred, I lay awake rewriting my understanding of where I stood. And the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was instructional, teaching me something I had avoided learning for years, which was that staying silent had not preserved harmony. It had only postponed reckoning, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility that felt both terrifying and grounding. The possibility that leaving might not be abandonment, but preservation, that stepping away might not mean giving up, but choosing to stop shrinking. And as the house finally fell asleep, and the laughter faded into the low hum of appliances, I closed my eyes not with sadness, but with a strange sense of alertness, because clarity has a way of sharpening your awareness. And in that clarity, I understood something critical, something that would guide every decision that followed, which was that I would not explain myself, I would not argue my history into relevance, and I would not announce my intentions, because the most effective changes are the ones that happen quietly, without warning. And as sleep finally claimed me in shallow waves, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind, steady and unresolved, that the next few days would decide whether I remained a tolerated presence or became something far more unsettling. A woman who remembered exactly who she was and what she still held. And that decision would not be made in anger, but in silence, because the next morning, instead of packing or confronting anyone, I made coffee as if nothing had happened. And that choice would change the direction of everything that came after. Why would someone stay after being made to feel like a burden? After hearing their worth reduced to what they consume rather than who they are? Because that's the question I imagine anyone would ask looking at me the next morning, standing in the kitchen before dawn, moving slowly but deliberately as I made coffee the same way I always had, measuring grounds by memory, rinsing the mug before pouring, listening to the familiar gurgle of the machine as if routine itself could anchor me. And the truth is I stayed because leaving immediately would have turned their words into authority, would have confirmed that sentence as a verdict instead of an opinion. And I was not ready to hand them that kind of power, not yet. So I moved through the house quietly, folding the blanket on the couch where my grandson had left it, picking up toys from the stairs not because it was expected, but because I wanted to observe how invisible care goes unnoticed when people assume it is automatic. And I watched the morning unfold without me being acknowledged. The way my son passed through the kitchen with a distracted nod, the way she avoided eye contact entirely. And I noticed how quickly discomfort fades when it isn't challenged. how easily people accept silence as agreement. And that realization sharpened my awareness rather than dulling it. Because I was no longer reacting, I was recording, noting how little effort it took for them to resume their lives, as if the night before had been nothing more than background noise. And I wondered how many times this had happened already. How many dismissals I had absorbed quietly, because speaking up felt disruptive. And as the day went on, I continued with small tasks my body allowed, mending a loose button on my grandson's jacket, sorting laundry at a pace that didn't inflame my joints, preparing a simple lunch no one commented on, and each unnoticed effort confirmed something I had avoided admitting, which was that usefulness only mattered when it was visible and convenient, and that anything done without demand would eventually be taken for granted. And yet I didn't stop, not because I hoped for recognition, but because I needed to see the pattern clearly, needed to understand whether this was a moment or a conclusion. And by the second day, the answer had become undeniable. Because conversations happened around me, plans were made without including me, and decisions were announced as if my agreement were assumed rather than requested. And I felt that peculiar loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who no longer see you as part of their present. And what surprised me most was not the hurt, but the calm that followed it, because once expectations die, clarity replaces them, and clarity is steady. And on the third morning, she mentioned casually that they would be gone for the weekend. Just the three of them, a couple's trip with the child included, space they apparently needed. And the way it was said told me everything, that my absence was already planned for, normalized, unremarkable. And my son stood there nodding as if this were obvious, as if I should have anticipated it. And in that moment, I understood that I was no longer part of their idea of family. I was an arrangement, temporary and conditional. And something inside me settled into place. Not anger, not resentment, but resolve. Because when people make plans that erase you without hesitation, the message is not subtle. And I realized then that staying longer would not restore balance. It would only prolong the erosion of whatever dignity I had left. And yet I still didn't react outwardly, still didn't challenge or protest. Because outward reactions invite arguments, and arguments invite justifications. And I had no interest in justifying my existence. So I waited, watched them pack bags and discuss departure times, noticed how no one asked if I needed anything, or where I would be, or how I felt about being left behind. And the absence of those questions spoke more loudly than any insult could. And when the house finally emptied, the silence felt different, not oppressive, but instructive, as if the walls themselves were telling me something I had been slow to hear. And I walked through the rooms slowly, not out of nostalgia, but awareness, noticing how much of myself existed in unseen corners, in routines no one noticed, in order maintained without praise. And I returned to the small room that held what little I had claimed as mine. And for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself to sit down and think without interruption. And the thought that surfaced surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, which was that I did not need to explain myself to leave, and I did not need permission to choose peace. And I began to pack, not everything, not in a rush, but deliberately, selecting only what mattered, a single suitcase with clothes chosen for comfort rather than appearance, a small bag of documents I had always kept close without fully remembering why, my rosary worn smooth by years of touch, and a leather-bound notebook filled with notes and fragments of a life I had lived quietly. And as I placed each item inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was intention, because this was not an escape, it was a transition, and I left no note, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because explanations invite debate, and debate invites dismissal, and I was done offering pieces of myself to be evaluated. So I placed the house key on the kitchen table beside a folded dish towel I had washed that morning. A small, ordinary gesture that said more than words ever could. And when I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I did not feel fear or regret, but relief. the kind that comes when a decision aligns with truth. And as I waited for the bus with aching knees and a steady heart, I understood that leaving quietly was not weakness. It was strategy. Because there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is remove yourself from a place that no longer recognizes you. And as the bus doors opened and I stepped inside without looking back, I knew something irreversible had begun. Something they would not notice right away, but would feel deeply when it reached them. Because while they believed they were simply enjoying a weekend away, I was carrying something with me that would redefine everything they thought they understood about that house, about me, and about what it truly meant to underestimate someone who has spent a lifetime surviving quietly. Because when I stepped off that bus, I didn't go to a friend's house or a shelter. I went somewhere that would force me to ask the one question I had avoided for years. What do you pack when you're leaving a life that slowly forgot you? When there's no emergency forcing you out and no argument pushing you forward. Only a steady inner voice telling you that staying would cost more than leaving. Because that was the question echoing in my mind as the bus lurched forward, carrying me across town with nothing but one suitcase at my feet and a smaller bag held close to my chest like instinct. And I watched familiar streets slide past the window. Neighborhoods I had known for decades suddenly feeling like scenery instead of belonging. And I realized that for the first time in years, no one knew exactly where I was going or when I would return. And instead of fear, what I felt was a strange, almost guilty relief. The kind that comes when responsibility loosens its grip just enough for you to breathe. And when the bus finally stopped, I stepped down slowly, my knees protesting as they always did, and found myself standing in front of a building I had researched quietly weeks before. Not because I planned to leave then, but because part of me had already been preparing for the possibility that staying might not always be an option. A modest care home with faded siding and a sign that didn't promise luxury or happiness, just safety and routine. And as I pushed open the door, the smell of disinfectant and boiled vegetables met me. Not unpleasant, just honest. And I was struck by how little explanation was required. Because the woman at the desk handed me a form without asking why I was there. As if she already understood that people don't arrive at places like this on a whim. And I smiled politely, answering questions about allergies and emergency contacts, feeling the weight of each blank space where family names might have gone. And I said things like it's temporary, like I just need quiet for a while, words chosen to soften reality rather than confront it. And when I was shown to my room, a narrow space with a twin bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot framed by a single tree, I sat down slowly and felt the stillness settle around me, a stillness so complete it felt almost loud. And for the first time since leaving the house, the question I had been avoiding finally caught up with me. Not what had they done, but what had I become? And I sat there wondering whether I really had crossed an invisible line where age turns contribution into inconvenience, where years of care and sacrifice are quietly reclassified as past relevance. And the thought that perhaps I truly was just someone who ate and took and no longer gave enough to justify my place pressed heavily on my chest. Because doubt is most dangerous when it borrows someone else's voice. And I stayed seated like that for a long time, listening to distant sounds of the building settling into its afternoon rhythm, carts rolling, voices murmuring, a television playing something cheerful in a common room I hadn't yet entered. And I thought about how easily people reduce lives to present utility, how quickly history is erased once it stops being useful. And I wondered if this was simply the natural order of things, if everyone eventually becomes excess. And the thought frightened me not because it was cruel, but because it felt plausible. And yet, somewhere beneath that doubt, something else stirred, quieter but more persistent. A memory of who I had been when survival demanded creativity and endurance. A woman who had managed households on nothing but discipline and stubborn hope, who had navigated sickness, scarcity, and loss without asking permission. And I realized then that what unsettled me most was not the insult I'd been given, but how close I had come to accepting it as truth. And that realization felt like a warning, because if I allowed myself to believe I was only what others currently needed, then I would vanish completely, not just from their lives, but from my own. And that was the moment I stood up, slowly but deliberately, and brewed a cup of tea using the small kettle provided, preparing it exactly how I liked it, strong and plain, a small act of familiarity that grounded me. And as I sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the blanket I had crocheted myself years earlier, I felt something return that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not confidence, not certainty, but self-recognition. The quiet awareness that I was still here, still thinking, still capable of choosing. And the thought that followed surprised me in its simplicity, which was, what if they were wrong? Not about the dinner table insult, but about me. What if I was not finished, not diminished, not obsolete? And that question changed the air in the room, because it shifted my focus from loss to possibility. And I reached for the phone, my fingers hesitating over the numbers stored there. Names I hadn't contacted in years because life had grown crowded and then distant. And I scrolled until I found one I hadn't thought of in a long time. My husband's oldest friend, the man who had helped us navigate paperwork and decisions when illness made everything feel urgent. And my heart thudded as I pressed call, not because I didn't know what to say, but because calling meant acknowledging that something in my life had shifted beyond denial. And when his voice answered, older but familiar, I spoke carefully, asking if he remembered the house deed, and the pause that followed told me everything. Not confusion, not doubt, but recognition. And when he said yes, that he remembered it clearly, I felt something inside me steady, like a door quietly unlocking, and I arranged to see him, thanked him, and ended the call with hands that no longer trembled, because whatever waited for me next, I knew it would not be built on assumption or dismissal. And that night, as I lay in the narrow bed listening to the distant sounds of other lives settling into sleep, I did not feel abandoned. I felt alert, because the question had changed, and instead of asking whether I was a burden, I was now asking what exactly I still held. And the answer to that question would not stay quiet for long. Because 3 days later, sitting across from him in a small office that smelled of old paper and memory, I would learn something they never expected me to remember. What would you do if the truth you buried to survive suddenly resurfaced with teeth? Because that was the thought pressing against my chest as I sat in the worn leather chair across from him, in an office that smelled like dust and old paper, and a past that never quite lets go. An office I hadn't entered in years, but somehow recognized immediately, as if memory has its own sense of direction. And he didn't rush to speak when I arrived, didn't ask polite questions or offer condolences. He simply poured tea the way he always used to, 2 sugars, no milk, and slid a thick folder across the desk, with a care that made my hands pause before touching it. Because part of me already sensed that whatever waited inside would rearrange my understanding of everything that had just happened. And as I opened it, slowly, deliberately, the way you open something you are not ready to fully face, I saw my name printed clearly where I hadn't expected it. Not alongside someone else's, not in fine print, but alone, unmistakable, followed by an address I knew by heart. And the date beneath it reached back decades, back to a time when my husband was still alive, and fear had sharpened every decision we made. And I heard myself whisper that I never knew he followed through, that I thought it was just something discussed, something planned but never completed. And he looked at me gently and told me that my husband came in the week after his diagnosis, that he sat in that very chair and said he didn't want me ever ending up dependent on gratitude, didn't want me staying somewhere out of obligation rather than choice. And as he spoke, my chest tightened not with grief, but with recognition, because that was exactly the kind of quiet protection my husband believed in. Not dramatic gestures, not speeches, but safeguards built into paper and law and foresight. And I stared at the document again, at the signature I recognized instantly, shaky but determined. And the realization landed slowly but completely. That the house I had been told to leave, the house I had scrubbed and repaired and filled with meals and memory, had never stopped being mine, not legally, not morally, not in any way that mattered. And the weight of that truth was staggering, because it reframed every insult, every dismissal, every moment of silence. And suddenly I understood why something inside me had resisted fully accepting their judgment, why doubt never quite settled into certainty, because somewhere deep down, I had always known I wasn't a guest asking permission to stay. I was the foundation they had built upon and then forgotten. And as he explained that the paperwork had been kept updated, that taxes and filings were current and secure, that everything was airtight, I felt a calm spread through me that surprised us both, because I wasn't angry, wasn't triumphant, wasn't even relieved. I was balanced, as if something that had been tilted for years had finally been set upright. And when he asked me what I wanted to do, his voice neutral, respectful, I didn't answer immediately, because decisions made in moments like that deserve silence before speech. And I thought about the dinner table, about the words that had been spoken so casually, about the silence that followed them. And I realized then that confronting them with this information would not restore dignity. It would only invite noise, and I had grown tired of noise. So I said quietly that I wanted to sell it, not dramatically, not publicly, but cleanly, without warning, and he didn't question me, didn't ask if I was sure. He simply nodded as if he understood that sometimes closure requires distance. And as he gathered the necessary forms, I held the folder close to my chest like armor, because paper has a way of speaking when people refuse to listen. And walking out of that office into the open air felt different from how I had entered, not lighter exactly, but steadier, because I was no longer operating on assumptions or hope or fear. I was operating on fact, and fact has weight. And as I returned to the care home that evening, passing through the familiar doors and nodding at faces that were becoming less unfamiliar by the day, I noticed something had changed in how I carried myself, how my shoulders sat, how my steps landed. Because knowing the truth about your position in the world does that. It reclaims space you didn't realize you'd given up. And later, sitting on my narrow bed with the folder spread open beside me, I read every line carefully, not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted to fully understand the gift my husband had left me. A gift not of money, but of agency. And I thought about how many women like me never discover these protections until it's too late. How often we trust that memory and love will be enough, and how easily we forget that the world respects documentation more than devotion. And I slept deeply that night, not because the future was settled, but because for the first time in years, I knew where I stood. And that knowledge quieted the constant calculation that had lived in my mind for too long. And over the next days, as paperwork began to move quietly through channels that don't require emotion to function, I returned to the care home routines with a different awareness, noticing the other residents. Their stories hinted at in posture and expression, and I wondered how many of them had also been told, in one way or another, that they were finished, that their usefulness had expired. And the thought settled into something purposeful, because I wasn't interested in revenge, not in making anyone suffer, but in restoring equilibrium, in reminding the world and myself that dignity does not evaporate with age. And as I signed the first document, my hand steady, my name clear, I felt no guilt, because guilt belongs to people who take what isn't theirs, and I was only reclaiming what had always been mine. And that clarity carried me forward quietly, decisively, without announcement, because the most unsettling transformations are the ones that happen without spectacle. And as the process moved ahead, invisible to those still living comfortably in a house they believed secure, I knew that when the truth finally reached them, it would arrive not as a conversation, but as consequence. And that was exactly how it needed to be, because I didn't tell them what I had discovered. And the reason I chose silence would make the fallout far more devastating than any argument ever could. Why didn't I tell them? Why didn't I pick up the phone or wait for them to return and place the truth neatly on the table, the way people expect resolution to happen? Because that question lingers whenever silence is mistaken for weakness. And the answer is simpler and harder than most people want to hear, which is that explanations are a luxury you stop offering once you realize they will only be used against you. Because when someone has already decided who you are, new information doesn't change their view. It only threatens it. And threatened people don't listen. They defend, they deny, they rewrite. And I had no interest in becoming a character in their revision of events. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because quiet allowed things to unfold without distortion. And as the paperwork moved forward in the background, unseen and unemotional, I returned to my days at the care home with a new kind of attentiveness, noticing how often people mistake stillness for absence, how easily those who speak the least are assumed to matter the least. And I watched how that assumption played out in small ways, in who was interrupted, who was rushed, who was overlooked, and I understood then that silence is only powerless when it's empty. But when it's paired with intention, it becomes something else entirely. Something that allows consequences to arrive cleanly, without interference. And there was a strange relief in that, in knowing I didn't need to persuade anyone, didn't need to be believed in advance, because the truth I held did not require their approval to function. And as days passed, I settled into routines that were no longer defined by obligation, but by choice, helping fold laundry alongside staff who never asked why I was there. Listening to residents tell fragments of their stories without demanding context. And I found myself feeling lighter, not because the situation was easy, but because I was no longer performing usefulness to justify my presence. And that contrast sharpened my resolve, because I realized how exhausting it had been to constantly prove my worth in a place that measured value by convenience. And I thought often about the moment at the dinner table, about how casually the words were spoken, and how that casualness revealed something important, which was that the insult wasn't emotional, it was administrative, a summary judgment delivered after long deliberation. And confronting that kind of conclusion rarely leads to accountability. It leads to minimization, to phrases like "you misunderstood" or "that's not what I meant." And I was done arguing over intent when the impact had already landed. So I let silence do what words never could. I let it create space for reality to operate without interference. And as the legal process continued, I noticed how calm I remained, how little desire I had to monitor outcomes or anticipate reactions, because the decision had already been made internally, and everything else was simply execution. And that calm surprised me, because I had always been the one who anticipated everyone else's needs, who tried to soften edges and prevent discomfort. And here I was, allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it. And that was new, unsettling in a good way, because it meant I was no longer managing other people's feelings at the expense of my own clarity. And occasionally, a flicker of doubt would surface, a whisper asking whether this was too much, whether silence was cruel, whether I owed them a warning. And each time it did, I returned to the same memory, the sound of my son's fork against his plate as he chose not to speak. And I understood that warnings are given when respect exists, not when it has already been withdrawn. And as the days stretched into weeks, the house I had left behind remained occupied by people unaware that the ground beneath them had shifted. And there was something almost instructive in that, in watching how certainty breeds complacency, how entitlement dulls awareness. And I didn't feel satisfaction in their ignorance. I felt distance from it, because I was no longer living in reaction to their expectations. And instead, I was learning what it felt like to exist without being measured. And that learning was reshaping me in ways I hadn't anticipated, because I found myself speaking more honestly with strangers than I ever had with family, laughing without monitoring volume, resting without guilt. And the longer this went on, the clearer it became that my silence was not passive. It was preparatory. It was the space in which something fair could take shape without interference. And I
But,
realized then that silence is often misinterpreted because people assume it means nothing is happening, when in reality,
but,
it often means everything important is already in motion. And when the final documents were ready, when signatures had been
but,
placed and timelines confirmed, I felt no rush of triumph, only confirmation, because the outcome aligned with the
but,
truth I had been carrying. And that alignment is deeply stabilizing. And I began to think less about the people I had left and
but,
more about what came next. Not because I was running from the past, but because I was no longer anchored to it. And in that
but,
forward-looking space, I understood that the real shift had already occurred long before any letter would arrive. Because the moment I
but,
stopped explaining myself was the moment I stopped asking for permission to exist. And that internal shift mattered more than any
but,
reaction they might have. And as the date approached when the silence would finally break, when information would reach them without my voice
but,
attached to it, I remained steady, not bracing for impact, because I knew that whatever followed would belong to them,
but,
not me. And that separation was essential, because I was no longer interested in carrying the emotional weight of consequences
but,
I did not create. And on the evening before everything changed, I sat quietly with a cup of tea, watching the light fade
but,
through a window that faced nothing remarkable, and I felt something close to peace, not because the story was ending, but because I had finally stepped out of the role that required me to absorb discomfort to keep others comfortable. And that, more than any
but,
document or decision, was the point of no return. Because when the letter finally arrived at that house, it didn't just deliver information, it shattered an assumption they never thought to question. What happens when certainty collapses without warning?
but,
When the ground you've been standing on suddenly explains itself as borrowed? Because that is what unfolded the day the letter arrived.
but,
Not with drama or raised voices or slammed doors, but with paper and ink and the kind of language that doesn't argue,
but,
doesn't accuse, just states. And I wasn't there to see it, which somehow felt appropriate, because consequences rarely require witnesses to be effective. And I imagined the moment clearly anyway, the way envelopes like that are opened casually at first. The confidence that comes from believing your position is permanent, and how quickly that confidence evaporates when words refuse to bend to expectation. And while I sat quietly in a common room folding towels with hands that moved slower than they used to, but steadier than they ever had, the reality I had set in motion was reaching them without my voice attached. And that mattered, because voices can be dismissed, but documents cannot. And I thought about how often people rely on familiarity to shield them from accountability. How living somewhere long enough convinces you that time itself grants ownership. And I wondered how long it took for understanding to dawn. Whether it arrived all at once or in fragments. Whether denial came first or anger. Because those are usually the first responses when entitlement is interrupted. And I didn't need to imagine long, because the phone began to ring that evening, my son's name lighting up the screen like a delayed recognition. And I watched it ring without answering, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Because whatever he wanted to say would not be about me. It would be about fear. And fear speaks loudly but rarely truthfully. And the calls continued over the next days, unanswered and insistent, as if persistence could rewrite what had already been formalized. And eventually a message arrived, carefully worded, uncertain, asking what was happening, asking if there had been a mistake, and I did not respond immediately, because urgency belongs to those who assume time will bend for them. And I had spent too many years bending myself to accommodate urgency that wasn't mine. And when I finally replied, it was brief and factual, that the transfer was legal, that the house was mine, that the process was complete. And I offered no apology, no explanation, because explanations invite negotiation, and negotiation suggests doubt, and I had none. And the silence that followed was brief but telling, because it was the silence of people recalculating their position. And then her voice arrived, sharp and incredulous, spilling outrage and accusation as if volume could substitute for authority. calling what I had done betrayal, cruelty, theft, and I listened without interruption, not because her words mattered, but because letting someone exhaust their anger often reveals the shape of it. And when she finished, breathless and furious, I spoke calmly, not defensively, not emotionally, just clearly that it had always been my home, that living somewhere does not make it yours, and that I had simply reclaimed what I had never given away. And the line went dead shortly after, not because she had nothing left to say, but because there was nothing left to argue. And that distinction mattered, because arguments thrive on ambiguity, and there was none left. And later that night, sitting by a window that overlooked a quiet courtyard, I thought about how often people mistake tolerance for consent, how easily patience is rebranded as permission. And I realized that the shock they were experiencing was not just about the house. It was about the collapse of a narrative they had grown comfortable with, the narrative where I was fixed, predictable, dependent, and therefore manageable. And when that narrative broke, so did their sense of control, and control, once exposed, reacts poorly to loss. And the next call came from my son again, his voice smaller this time, stripped of certainty, asking how this could have happened, how I could do this without telling them. And I listened as he spoke, not interrupting, because he was finally saying things he had never said before, acknowledging fear, confusion, regret. And when he paused, waiting for reassurance or rescue, I did not provide it, because reassurance would have returned us to old roles, and rescue would have rewritten history as misunderstanding rather than consequence. And instead, I said something simple, that I had not taken anything from them, that I had only stopped giving what I was never obligated to provide indefinitely. And that silence settled over the line again, heavier this time, because it carried recognition rather than outrage. And I could hear in his breathing that he was processing something deeper than logistics, something about how easily he had allowed someone else to reduce me without challenge. And that realization does not land gently. And I did not comfort him through it, because growth rarely arrives through comfort. And the days that followed were filled with aftermath I did not chase. Messages passed through others, attempts to explain, to justify, to reframe. And I declined all of it, not because I was unwilling to listen, but because listening would have pulled me back into a dynamic where my role was to absorb and stabilize, and I had stepped out of that role intentionally. And as the reality settled in, I imagined the house shifting from certainty to countdown, from assumed permanence to numbered days, and I felt no satisfaction in that image, no pleasure in displacement, because this was never about punishment. It was about alignment, about restoring a balance that had been ignored for too long. And what surprised me most was how calm I remained throughout it all, how little I felt compelled to defend my choice. Because the moment someone understands that you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, the need for justification evaporates. And that understanding had finally reached me. And as the letters did their work and timelines began to close in around them, I remained where I was, steady, unflinching, no longer defined by reaction. And it occurred to me then that the most unsettling part of this for them was not losing the house, but losing the version of me they thought they understood, the one who stayed quiet, absorbed discomfort, and smoothed consequences. And that version was gone, replaced by someone they did not know how to manage, someone who had stopped explaining herself. And that shift, more than any document, was what truly unsettled them. Because when the panic finally settled and the anger ran out, something else surfaced. And the cost of years of silence began to reveal itself in ways none of us had expected. What does a lifetime of quiet generosity actually cost? Not in dollars alone, but in pieces of yourself you never thought to count. Because that was the question that kept returning to me after the anger burned out and the panic settled, after the calls slowed and the silence changed its tone. And I found myself sitting alone one evening in my small room, opening a drawer I hadn't touched since arriving, a drawer that held nothing dramatic at first glance, just a few cards, prayer beads worn smooth by years of use, and a leather-bound notebook my husband had given me long ago, and I hadn't opened it in years, not because I forgot about it, but because it had never been meant as evidence. It had been meant as memory. And as I turned the pages slowly, the smell of paper and ink brought back moments I had tucked away without ceremony. Notes written not with resentment but practicality. Reminders of what had been given when it was needed most. And line by line, year by year, I saw the quiet ledger of a life spent filling gaps others never noticed. Tuition covered when plans fell apart. Rent paid when pride wouldn't allow them to ask. Medical bills settled without discussion. Groceries purchased during lean months without expectation of thanks. And the more I read, the heavier the realization became. Not because I regretted any of it, but because I had never allowed myself to see it all together, to acknowledge the full weight of what I had carried without complaint. And I understood then that silence doesn't erase effort. It just hides it. And being hidden for too long had allowed others to believe nothing was there at all. And I felt a deep, aching sadness not for the money, but for the years of care that had been reduced to inconvenience by people who never thought to look back. And as I continued reading, I noticed something else, something unexpected, which was how consistent the pattern was, how often my help arrived at moments of crisis, how reliably I stepped in to stabilize situations that would have unraveled without intervention. And I realized then that what I had provided was not just financial support, but continuity, the assurance that someone would absorb the shock so others could move forward uninterrupted. And that kind of labor is invisible by design, because its success lies in preventing disaster, not being credited afterward. And seeing it laid out like that shifted something inside me, because it forced me to confront how easily women like me are written out of their own contributions. How often we confuse love with self-erasure, believing that keeping score would somehow cheapen what we gave, when in reality, refusing to acknowledge cost only makes exploitation easier. And I sat there for a long time, the notebook open on my lap, feeling the weight of every entry not as accusation, but as truth. And I understood then that the insult I'd received had not come from nowhere. It had grown in the fertile ground of my own silence, nurtured by my refusal to be seen. And that realization was uncomfortable but clarifying, because it meant I could not undo the past, but I could refuse to let it repeat itself. And the decision that followed was not fueled by bitterness, but by responsibility. Because if I allowed these contributions to remain invisible, then the narrative that I was merely a burden would persist unchallenged, not just in their minds, but in my own. And I would not allow that, not anymore. So I began to organize the pages, copying entries carefully, labeling them not for confrontation but for record, because documentation is not vengeance, it is preservation. And as I worked, I felt something like respect return, not from others, but from myself, because acknowledging what you've given does not diminish generosity. It restores balance. And when I finished, I placed the notebook back in the drawer, not with shame or secrecy, but with intention, knowing that its contents would not be used to shame or demand repayment, but to ensure that the truth could not be rewritten when memory became convenient. And I made copies and passed them quietly to the same hands that had safeguarded the deed, not as ammunition, but as testament. And I said simply that someday, if questions were asked, I wanted the answers to exist without my voice attached, because voices can be dismissed, but records endure. And as I handed them over, I felt a sense of closure settle around that chapter of my life, because I was no longer carrying those years alone. And the relief that followed surprised me, because it wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was steady, like setting down a weight you didn't realize you were still holding. And that steadiness allowed space for something new to surface, a thought I hadn't considered until then, which was what should happen next, not to punish anyone, not to reclaim status, but to ensure that what I had endured could become something useful rather than simply painful. And as that idea formed, quietly but insistently, I realized that the story did not have to end with loss or separation. It could pivot toward purpose, toward something that acknowledged the invisible labor of people like me without demanding gratitude in return. And that possibility stirred something hopeful inside me, because it suggested that dignity could be rebuilt, not through confrontation, but through creation. And as I closed the drawer and turned off the light that night, I understood that the house I had sold was not the end of my story. It was the resource that would allow me to write the next chapter on my own terms. And the shape of that chapter was beginning to take form in my mind, quiet but unmistakable, because the money from that house was never meant to sit untouched. It was about to become something that would outlive the insult that started it all. What if pain could be repurposed instead of relived? What if the thing meant to diminish you could be transformed into something that quietly protected others? Because that question followed me everywhere once the sale was complete, and the numbers stopped being abstract and became real. And contrary to what people might imagine, the money didn't feel like victory or revenge or even relief. It felt like responsibility, heavy and clarifying. Because I understood immediately that spending it on myself would have closed the story too easily, would have turned everything that had happened into a transaction instead of a reckoning. And I wasn't interested in proving I could live comfortably. I was interested in proving that dignity could be rebuilt without permission. And so I began to look, not for a new home for myself, but for a place where people like me could exist without being measured, without being tolerated, without having to earn their right to stay. And the search was quiet and deliberate. Afternoons spent walking through neighborhoods most people my age are never shown. Places with faded paint and uneven steps and bones strong enough to last if someone cared enough to see potential instead of decay. And when I found it, a small building with multiple units and a sagging porch that needed work but stood solid despite neglect, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, but recognition, because it wasn't grand, it wasn't impressive. It didn't promise comfort or prestige, but it promised use, and use mattered to me more than appearance ever had. And when the agent looked at me with polite confusion and suggested retirement communities instead, I shook my head, because retirement implies stepping away from meaning, and I wasn't finished. I was redirecting, and I purchased the building without fanfare, signing papers with the same steady clarity that had guided every decision since the dinner table. And I named it Haven House, not because it was a refuge from the world, but because it was a place where people would not have to justify their existence to remain. And as the weeks passed, and the building slowly changed shape under care and attention, paint replacing stains, light fixtures warming rooms that had been dim too long, gardens planted in repurposed containers because beauty doesn't require permission either, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was alignment. The sense that what I was building reflected who I had always been beneath the silencing. And people arrived gradually, not in response to an announcement, but through quiet networks of need. Women who had been asked to leave without explanation, men whose usefulness had expired in the eyes of their families, people who carried their histories in posture and silence rather than words. And I didn't ask for their stories up front, because I knew better than anyone that stories arrive when safety does. And instead, I focused on creating an environment where no one needed to apologize for slowing down, where help was offered without condition, where privacy was respected and dignity assumed. And as the house filled with life again, not loud or chaotic but steady and real, I watched something remarkable happen. People who had been shrinking for years began to take up space again. Laughter returned tentatively at first, then freely. Routines formed that weren't enforced, but chosen, shared meals that felt communal rather than obligatory. And I realized then that what I had lost at my son's table was being rebuilt here without expectation or demand. And the irony was not lost on me. That being called a burden had led to the creation of a place where no one would ever be labeled that way again. And I took on the role of organizer not because I needed authority, but because I understood structure, doctor appointments scheduled without fuss, paperwork explained patiently, small conflicts resolved with respect rather than dismissal, and the house breathed with a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. And one afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen watching someone carefully portion soup for everyone else before serving themselves last, I recognized the gesture immediately, the habit of self-erasure, and I gently interrupted, reminding them that here, no one eats last by default, and the look on their face told me everything. Surprise mixed with something like grief, because being seen after long invisibility can feel almost painful at first. And that moment stayed with me, because it confirmed that this place mattered, not as charity, but as correction. And as Haven House settled into itself, I found that my own sense of worth was no longer tied to how others perceived me. Because I was no longer asking to be included, I was building inclusion, and that distinction mattered more than I could have imagined. And yet, even as this new chapter took shape, I was aware that the past had not finished speaking. Because stories like mine don't resolve neatly, they echo, and I knew that eventually, someone from my old life would reach this place, not to challenge it, but to confront what it represented, and that knowledge didn't fill me with dread. It filled me with readiness, because I had already done the hardest work, which was choosing to stop shrinking. And as I locked the front door one evening and turned off the lights, listening to the house settle into sleep around me, I understood that the transformation was complete, not because everything was perfect, but because the pain that once defined me had been converted into purpose, and that purpose would not be undone by anyone's discomfort. Because not long after Haven House opened its doors, someone I hadn't expected walked through them, and the silence between us said more than any apology ever could. What do you owe someone who remembers you only after losing what they assumed was permanent? Because that was the question I asked myself the moment I saw him standing there, not demanding entry, not calling my name, just waiting at the edge of the porch like someone, unsure whether they were allowed to take another step. And I recognized him instantly despite how different he looked. Shoulders curved inward as if the weight he carried was no longer theoretical. Eyes searching the space around him, as if trying to understand how something he dismissed had grown into something he could no longer ignore. And I didn't rush toward him, didn't harden or soften my expression, because this was not a confrontation I had rehearsed. It was a reckoning that had arrived on its own time, and I gestured for him to sit without speaking, because silence has a way of stripping people down to what they actually came to say. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with excuses or explanations. It was with admission, halting and unpolished, telling me that the house was gone, that the certainty he had lived inside had collapsed faster than he could adjust, that his marriage had fractured under pressure, that he had mistaken stability for entitlement and quiet for consent. And I listened without interruption, not because I needed to hear it, but because he needed to say it without being rescued from the discomfort of his own clarity. And when he paused, waiting perhaps for reassurance or forgiveness, or a way back into the version of our relationship that required me to absorb and steady, I didn't offer any of that, because doing so would have erased the growth happening right in front of me. And instead, I stood and retrieved a photograph from a small box I kept nearby. A photograph taken early in Haven House's life, when the paint was still drying and the garden hadn't yet learned where it wanted to grow, showing a group of people laughing mid-task, unposed and unself-conscious. And I handed it to him without explanation, and he studied it carefully, confusion giving way to recognition as he understood what he was looking at. Not a shelter, not a project, but a home built intentionally. And he asked quietly if this was what I had done with the money, and I nodded. And the silence that followed was different from the ones we had shared before. Not dismissive, not evasive, but heavy with understanding. And he asked why, not an accusation but disbelief. Why I would take something meant to secure my own comfort and redirect it outward. And that was when I finally spoke, not to defend myself, but to name the truth, telling him that I had eaten his food for a year, yes, but that he had eaten mine for decades. Not just meals, but labor, patience, stability, and that I wasn't collecting repayment, only acknowledging the balance, and he lowered his eyes then. Not in shame alone, but in recognition. Because numbers can be argued with, but patterns cannot. And he told me he was sorry. Not in the way people say it to be absolved, but in the way they say it when they finally understand the cost of their silence. And I accepted the apology without ceremony, not because it erased the past, but because it marked the present honestly. And I told him something I had rehearsed quietly long before he arrived, that I did not need his guilt, his money, or his promises, that what I needed had already been restored, which was my sense of self outside of his approval. And I explained that Haven House did not exist to repair our relationship or redeem his mistakes. It existed because too many people had been taught that love must be earned continuously or it expires. And I refused to build anything on that lie again. And when he asked if there was anything he could do, any way to help, I shook my head, not unkindly, and told him that growth cannot be outsourced, that the best way to honor what I had given was not to attach himself to what I was building, but to live differently moving forward, to notice who is being diminished quietly around him, and to speak before silence hardens into erasure. And he nodded slowly, absorbing that this was not a door reopening but a line being drawn. And when he stood to leave, he looked around once more, taking in the warmth, the ease, the absence of hierarchy. And I could see then that what unsettled him most was not what he had lost, but what he had never thought possible. That the woman he underestimated had built something that did not require him at all. And as he stepped off the porch and back into the world that would now demand something different from him, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a quiet completion, because this meeting was not about reconciliation. It was about release, and release does not always come with closeness. Sometimes it comes with clarity, and as the door closed behind him, I returned to the life unfolding inside the house, the shared tasks, the gentle disagreements, the unremarkable moments that together formed something durable. And I understood that whatever happened next in his life would no longer define mine. And that separation was not punishment, it was peace. Because as calm as everything felt afterward, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. The ending wasn't about him at all. It was about what remains when nothing needs proving anymore. What does justice look like when no one is watching? When there is no audience to applaud restraint or condemn cruelty? Because that was the question I found myself answering not in words, but in mornings. In the way sunlight entered the kitchen at Haven House without needing permission. In the way people moved through the space without apologizing for taking up room. And I realized that justice, at least the kind that lasts, rarely announces itself. It settles, it becomes routine. It shows up in chipped mugs used without embarrassment and chairs pulled out without hesitation. And on quiet afternoons when the house hummed with ordinary life, knitting needles clicking softly, a radio playing something slightly out of tune, someone laughing too loudly, and no one asking them to stop, I understood that this was the ending I hadn't known how to imagine back when I was sitting at that dinner table swallowing words. Because back then, I thought justice would look like an apology or recognition or regret. And what I got instead was something steadier, the absence of needing those things at all. And as seasons shifted, as they always do, I watched the house change subtly. Gardens thickening, routines settling, relationships deepening without urgency. And I saw in the residents the same transformation that had taken place in me. Shoulders lifting, voices strengthening, laughter returning without fear. And it struck me how little it takes to restore dignity once the conditions are right. How quickly people bloom when they are no longer required to justify their existence. And I thought often about the woman I used to be. The one who measured her worth by how little trouble she caused, by how much she absorbed quietly, by how efficiently she erased herself for the comfort of others. And I didn't feel anger toward her, only tenderness, because she did what she knew how to do to survive. And survival is not shameful, but staying in survival mode forever is costly. And Haven House became, for me and for others, a place where survival was no longer the goal, where living could be enough. And sometimes visitors would come, not reporters or officials, just people like us, hovering at the edge of possibility, asking careful questions about how it worked, why it existed. And I never gave speeches, never framed it as inspiration. I simply said that no one here had to earn their right to stay. And that sentence alone seemed to loosen something in them, as if they had been waiting a long time to hear it. And in the evenings, when the porch filled with conversation and the air cooled enough to invite stillness, I would sit with a cup of tea and listen, really listen, not as a caretaker or a fixer, but as a witness. And I learned then that listening without trying to correct or solve is one of the most radical forms of respect. And that respect, once introduced, tends to spread quietly. And there were moments, of course, when memories returned uninvited. Flashes of that house I left, that table, that sentence that started everything. And when they did, I didn't push them away because they no longer hurt the same way. They felt like reference points rather than wounds, reminders of how far I had moved internally. And sometimes I wondered whether they understood now, whether silence had finally taught what words never could. But the answer mattered less with each passing day, because my life was no longer organized around their understanding. And that, I realized, was the truest form of freedom. Not being believed, not being validated, but being complete without those things. And one afternoon, as I watched someone teach another how to mend a torn sleeve patiently, without judgment, I smiled at how ordinary the moment was, and how extraordinary it would have seemed to me once. And I understood that endings don't always arrive with closure conversations or reconciliations or neatly tied bows. Sometimes they arrive as quiet competence, as belonging that doesn't ask questions, as days that don't require armor. And I thought about all the women who never get to tell their stories, who assume it's too late, who stay in rooms that make them smaller because leaving feels selfish or frightening. And if there is one thing I wish I could offer them, it would not be advice or instruction, but permission to stop shrinking, permission to walk away without shouting, permission to trust that their value does not expire when their usefulness changes. Because I didn't begin this journey brave. I began it tired of explaining, tired of hoping to be seen by people who benefited from not seeing me. And if you are listening to this and recognizing yourself in any part of it, if you have ever stayed quiet to keep peace, ever doubted your worth because it was no longer convenient, ever wondered whether leaving would erase you completely, let me tell you this. Leaving did not erase me. It revealed me. And what I built afterward was not an act of revenge. It was an act of remembering who I was before the world told me to be smaller, remembering that dignity is not granted. It is claimed. And this story, my story, is not meant to shame or accuse or instruct. It is meant to remind you that silence does not have to be your final language, that walking away can be an act of strength, and that sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones that don't look like endings at all, but like beginnings no one expected. And as the house settled into evening, lights glowing softly behind windows that held no fear, I felt a deep, unshakable peace, not because everything had been fixed, but because I had finally stopped disappearing. And that, I think, is what justice looks like when no one is watching. Not loud, not cruel, not dramatic, but lasting. And if you've ever been made to feel like a burden just for existing, remember this. The quietest lives often leave the deepest echoes, and it's never too late to start listening to your own.